Have you ever heard that anxiety problems are on the rise? Well, if it's true for adults, it's definitely true for kids. And I'm a child psychologist, and I'm here to talk with you in depth about childhood anxiety, what it is, and why it is often missed. Let's dig in. Hi out there. This is Dr. Brett Pearce, child psychologist, coming at you with another educational video. This time, by popular request from, friends and subscribers and things like that, I am going to be doing a fairly deep dive into the subject of childhood anxiety. Anxiety disorders are a thing in mental health, which most people who think of adults more or less understand. Yeah, okay, anxiety problems. They can be so intense that they can cause a big problem for an adult. They can make an adult feel like they can't leave the house or go to work or get really stressed out in certain situations or even have outright panic attacks that are extraordinarily debilitating. What a lot of people, though, really seem to struggle with is understanding that kids can have anxiety problems too. And just like anxiety disorders being sort of like the bread and butter kind of, anxiety and depression or the cold and flu of adult mental health, this is also true of children. But this gets missed a lot and gets branded, behavior issues or misdiagnosis, things like ODD or ADHD, by even a lot of well-intended professionals, just because it is understandably a little bit mysterious to understand how anxiety looks and operates in kids, and there's a variety of reasons for that. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing anxiety in kids in basically two big ways. First of all, I'm simply going to go over some details about what it often looks like. Second of all, I'm going to go over some details on why it is often missed, so that hopefully anyone watching this video can understand what some common pitfalls are when it comes to childhood anxiety, and they can hopefully steer clear of them. So first, let's talk about what childhood anxiety is. Well, an overview of anxiety, whether you're talking about an adult or a kid, would be that you're talking about a set of feelings, thoughts, and behaviors that largely connects with a very kind of, I guess you could call it a troubled or a difficult or a complex relationship with the raw feeling of fear. Anxiety deeply connects with fear. And effectively what you're talking about is a mind-body situation associated with a lot of anticipatory fear, about the future, because it's hard to fear the past, because it's already done. Anxiety, when it comes to thoughts, it often connects with a lot of apprehension about future events. When you're talking about feelings, anxiety tends to connect deeply with the fight, flight, or freeze response, which is, by the way, part of why anxiety disorders in kids tend to look like just behavior problems, because you've got a kid who, their whole fight or flight system is all scawampus, and you often find that they are fighting or they are freezing when adults are telling them to do something, and then we think it's defiance. Or they're running away from situations, which we can also view as a kind of behavior problem or defiance or something like that, like not wanting to listen to adult authority. In terms of what behaviors tend to be connected with anxiety, well, more classically, you're looking at a complex set of behaviors that are all crafted at trying to deal with the anxiety. So I guess what those things could look like, usually it's a lot of avoidance of things that are triggering to the anxiety. There can also be a lot of kind of gaminess surrounding the anxiety, which is a kind of avoidance. So for example, one common one that I see a lot is bedtime anxiety, because a lot of kids who are anxious are very, very anxious when it comes to going to bed. And that's because they're alone, usually. It's dark. Their imagination starts to go wild. By the way, do you know that anxiety is one of the most common reasons people struggle to sleep? And that's because similar reasons to what I just mentioned, but also it's time to kind of slow down and allow the body and the mind to calm and to get ready for sleep. And many people who have a lot of anxiety find that being occupied mentally and physically, helps sort of distract them from their anxiety. Although being distracted from your anxiety is not a good ultimate solution, but it can be fairly helpful in short-term kind of crisis-y situations, and that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. But bottom line is, you'll see kids who are struggling to separate from mom and dad to go to sleep because they are terrified at night. And so what they do is they start to get really anxious and hyped up, and people think that, they're intentionally trying to keep themselves from winding down. Well, in a sense, you're right. It's because they're scared, but also their anxiety is getting going the closer you get to bedtime. So their adrenaline kicks in because of the stress and anxiety. So in terms of just general disorders that you would find that connect with anxiety in childhood, well, generalized anxiety disorder, which is diagnosable in kids as well as adults. Selective mutism, which is rather rare, but it's certainly an anxiety diagnosis. Usually connects with a lot of fear about speaking. Separation anxiety is a diagnosable disorder. And then sort of conditions that are related to anxiety, like PTSD and OCD and things like that, are absolutely diagnosable in kids. Then certainly things like panic disorder is also diagnosable in kids. So anxiety is a thing for kids, and it connects deeply with the fight, flight, or freeze response, particularly when it kind of goes haywire. And effectively what you're talking about is when kiddo starts to have a hard time really understanding and operating in a way that seems to make sense in the situation when it comes to fear. So fear, of course, is a normal feeling. It's a good feeling. And it's a good feeling because imagine how we would survive without the emotion of fear. We wouldn't. We'd effectively have no way of understanding, for example, that you need to be careful when you cross the street. It's not necessarily that you have to be terrified of crossing the street, but there's enough of a sense of, okay, I fear being hit by a car because that would genuinely be very dangerous to my body and my life. So I pause and I attend to that danger. It's just that we have a clear enough relationship with the fear that we know that if we look and see that it's clear, then we may proceed. And so the fear doesn't scream so loudly. Whereas if you were, say blindfolded or something like that, if you're a person who's normally seeing, and you were then asked to cross the road, it would be very justifiable if you were terrified, because you would have your mechanism for interfacing with that fear and making a wise decision about how to proceed. Sounds awfully kind of deep and complex about such a routine thing, but that's really how the process goes. The reason that most kids don't have tons of anxiety about crossing the street is because they're able to relate with their fear in that situation in a clear, wise fashion. So when the anxiety starts to become a problem, and perhaps kiddo in question is terrified of crossing the street because they're terrified of physical danger of any kind, it doesn't matter how much of a risk it really is, what happens is the fear starts to dominate, and basically what you have is kiddo basically saying, I can't tolerate any level of feeling fear, and they scramble to avoid fear or ward it off in some kind of way. And what that paradoxically does is that bid for warding off or avoiding the fear then entrenches fear and makes it difficult for us to have a wise, healthy relationship with the fear. And so that's, basically what childhood anxiety can look like in a nutshell. Childhood anxiety is absolutely treatable. I've treated, a couple thousand kids for anxiety problems. It's a very common issue. But the biggest thing that I'd like you to take out of this piece of this talk that I'm giving is that anxiety is a thing in kids. It's a common thing, and it's a lot more common than we know. I don't still have the reference on hand, but what I understand is that research came out about 10 years ago basically saying, a lot of these kids that we are diagnosing with ADHD and ODD actually have anxiety and depression instead. And this is what I mean by us having a tendency to want to call kids who are struggling emotionally. We have a tendency to want to call them misbehaving, or perhaps say that they have some kind of neurodevelopmental disorder that is resulting, like ADHD, that is resulting in problems. I probably have already done another video on the subject, although I can't remember right offhand. But ADHD and anxiety in kids can, look like each other. So that's another story. So let's talk about why ADHD, why anxiety is often missed in kids. Well, one of the big issues is that kids don't have a lot of the bank of experience or the wherewithal in terms of their self-reflective capacity to be able to really kind of go, okay, what is really going on for me here in this situation? Many adults even struggle with that, and it's surprising how often you'll even find that adults don't seem to really understand that even when they're having outright panic attacks. In fact, interestingly, with panic attacks in particular, and there's nothing exactly wrong with this fact, but one of the very common ways that folks find out that they're having a panic attack is that they go to the ER because they think they're having a heart attack. Now, of course, when you think you're having a heart attack, the ER is a good priority, right? But it's also just interesting to note that that's a real common way, because I think what I've noticed is that our culture, at least here in America, dominant culture in America, just doesn't seem well equipped to help people really understand the nuance of their experience, particularly when it comes to when behavioral and emotional difficulties, mental health concerns really become entrenched. Part of that, I think, is because there's such a stigma surrounding mental health. And in many ways, I believe there's even more of a stigma surrounding mental health in kids. And so kids don't have a lot of good language for this. They don't really know how to go, wow, I'm really nervous and stressed out all the time, and I'm up in my head anticipating the future and ruminating over the future and really going over it, trying to steel myself against all these things that I think could go wrong or, that are going to be bad. And with kids, these are often things like getting into trouble with their parents, getting into trouble at school, interactions with peers at school, perhaps fights with, that they're having with peers or perhaps siblings, physical injuries, separation, either actually physically separating from their parents or being preoccupied with things that could happen to, their family or their parents that might take them away, like, if I leave you and go to school, mom and dad, then bad guys are going to come get you, and that will take you, that would be terrifying and take you away from me. Natural disasters and things like that, it can also be a fairly common subject of worry for kids. So we miss anxiety in kids because we don't, or rather kids don't necessarily have the wherewithal to say, wow, what's really going on here is that I am worried all the time. And so instead, those difficulties are just going to kind of get acted out without necessarily enough of kind of like a self-reflective capacity that helps us kind of make sense of what we're doing and what we're experiencing while we experience it. That's actually a fairly sophisticated cognitive skill. So that's one big one. Another big one, I think, has to do with a lot of our culture's ways of viewing kids. So a couple of common myths that I hear about kids when it comes to anxiety as well as just other emotional difficulties. I hear that kids can't have anxiety unless they have a trauma. Now, when I say trauma, what I'm saying is that there's this way where we feel like the only way that a kid could have these emotional difficulties is if they've had some really big adverse event. Now, which is interesting because it's in a way almost the opposite idea of what anxiety problems are. In general, when we have anxiety problems, it's understood that the anxiety comes without necessarily what most people would consider an appropriate trigger, right? So an example of this might be if if I don't know, there's a window right here in my home office where I'm recording this. If someone jumped through this window and was hostile towards me and started attacking me, if I experienced an explosion of anxiety and a fight or flight response in that situation, that's pretty appropriate, right? It would be sort of weird if I would just like, oh, hi there, like, I mean, it'd be strange. So we wouldn't necessarily call that, an anxiety attack exactly. I mean, I guess you could, but it's more of a pretty normal response to an abnormal situation. Whereas folks who struggle with anxiety would tend to have close to that level of response to things that are a lot more daily, or day to day rather, and don't pose anywhere near as much of a threat in proportion to the response that they're having to it. So what very commonly, folks who have anxiety problems don't have a trauma in their background, and so that's one thing that you hear. I mean, you hear some people think about adult anxiety too, is that, well, you can't have an anxiety problem because you don't have any trauma going on. So that's a big one. Another one that people run into trouble with is that this is an understandable one, because it's really challenging to really get inside the mind of a kid and to understand that because kids' minds are less well developed, their bodies are less well developed, their bank of experience is, I mean, if you're talking about a 7 or 8 year old, if you compare that with, say, 40-year-old parent, 40-year-old parent has 5 times the bank of experience to draw on, and experience tends to help with wisdom, right? Like when at first you're learning to drive a car, it can be pretty terrifying, but after you've been doing it for even just a year, it's likely not anywhere near as scary. And that's because as we experience things, we start to get better at them, we start to master them, and we also have a bank of experience to compare things to, so that we can kind of go, oh, yeah, well, driving a car, you need to be careful, but it's not necessarily something to panic about in most situations. So that's a big one, where folks have a hard time understanding that the things that kids get anxious about when they have anxiety problems, most parents think that they're just faking it, or that it's just kind of like the kid being a kid or something like that, or that they're just trying to get out of doing something. Some people go so far as to say that the kid's manipulating, which is a word that's particularly triggering to me when it comes to kids in particular. And that's the subject of a whole other video that I believe I've already done towards the beginning of the channel's life. But the bottom line is, it's understandable, because we're going, well, why would you be freaked out about going to school? It's school. Like, it's as, common as apple pie. It's every day. But for the kid, that's, what are they going to be stressed about? Stuff that has nothing to do with them, that doesn't even enter their minds, like finances and things like that. I mean, those are things that kids wouldn't even have access to. And so when a kid has anxiety, the anxiety tends to get located onto the things that the kid does and thinks about, right? Which of course makes sense. And so what kids do is go to school, and they play and they deal with their friends, and kids are very, very understandably dependent upon teachers and parents. And those relationships are critical to the kid. And so they tend to also get stressed out about things like that. So that's the second reason I think we tend to miss anxiety problems in kids, is because it's understandably difficult for us to really go, okay, wow, this kid really is stressed out about whatever it is, about this grade on a test. And it's like, well, but you're in second grade. I mean, your grades don't really matter, but for the kid, they really, really, really do matter a lot. And so we tend to be kind of, in a way, sort of dismissive often of the kinds of things that kids get anxious about. And in some cases, it's understandable, because kids are not necessarily known for being as rational as adults. And sometimes kids, even very bright kids, when they have a lot of anxiety, it's about things that we almost think are kind of laughable, and might be kind of laughable to an adult. For example, kiddo might be scared of monsters or something like that, things that we know that are objectively not real, or at least not physically real. Maybe they're mentally real or something like that. But the bottom line is, but for the kiddo, that's what they're terrified about, and they just don't have the same relationship with understanding objective truth as an adult, and so they're not able to have a wise relationship with that situation. Whereas with, most adults, you could watch a scary movie and be scared during the scary movie, but you're able to let it go enough that it doesn't perhaps interrupt your sleep. And there's nothing wrong with you if it does interrupt your sleep, because some scary movies are scary. I like them, and I like them because they scare me, not because they don't. But the bottom line is, when you hear kiddo who's terrified of, say, the boogeyman at night, it's very easy for us to go, yeah, you're just making that up because you don't want to go to bed. And in some cases, perhaps that's true. But in many cases, it's really, really true. The kid's legitimately terrified and does not have access to, enough of the right tools, both inside themselves as well as kind of outside themselves, I guess, to be able to navigate that situation and find their way to be calm and in control and able to sleep. So that's another one that we really need to be careful about. I think the third reason that we have a hard time recognizing anxiety in kids is because I think we're as a culture pretty eager to do this thing where with kids we're very eager to do this kind of punishment misbehavior thing, where there's this thing we act out with kids where it seems to be a lot about affirming our position as the ones in charge. Now, when it comes to kids, adults should be the ones in charge. That's absolutely not under dispute here, certainly not by me. But I think there's something particularly appealing to a lot of adults where it's easy for us to go the direction of saying, okay, whatever it is that you're dealing with, whatever's not working with us here, it's because you are not obeying me. You need to learn discipline. You need to be punished. You need to something like that. There's this kind of discipline thing that we do that is particularly appealing to us. And if we're honest with ourselves, I mean, there can be a real gratification in kind of holding the power and doling out punishments and rewards and consequences and things like that. And that's, I mean, pretty much anyone can be vulnerable to that. It being a little too appealing. And so instead of slowing ourselves down and going, okay, I'm frustrated, and okay, kiddo keeps defying me when I say it's time for you to take out the garbage, but we struggle sometimes, I think, because of the discipline misbehavior thing, which is one of our only ways, I think, in this culture of really understanding childhood behavior and childhood emotional difficulties. It's one of the only models and kind of sort of structures in our culture that gives us anything in terms of how to understand what's going on. So we over apply that and we rush to apply it because then there's an assertion of power. So taking the example of kiddo who maybe is struggling to take out the garbage, there's all kinds of reasons for that. So if we reflect on it, we might go, okay, so we typically do that after dinner. It's typically dark. Kiddo has to go out into close to this shed where, it's dark and maybe there's bugs and things like that, because there's plenty of people who are, very uncomfortable with or even have an anxiety problem regarding bugs or rodents or other creepy crawlers. So we're kind of engineering this perfect storm where the kiddo's kind of going out into the dark alone. Has to deal with icky garbage, and there's nothing wrong with having to take out the garbage, and then all of a sudden there's concerns about bugs and things like that and rodents around, and maybe the kiddo's even seen a rodent at the garbage. And it's not that I'm saying that we should do everything for the kiddo, but we start to understand, okay, wow, this kiddo isn't just being defiant. This kiddo is very anxious and doesn't have the tools or the psychological resources necessary to even really recognize it exactly, let alone figure out how to navigate through it towards a higher level of growth and self-mastery that would allow them to have a good relationship with their fear, to understand that, well, it's very unlikely to be a legitimate danger for me to just go take the garbage out, even if there are bugs and rodents and things like that. So one of the third things, I think I'm still on number 3 at least, but one of the big things that I really think is a problem is that our culture really lacks a lot of good structure and articulation and language for us to understand how to help kids who have emotional difficulties, and I think it struggles a lot more with adults too. But I think that there's a particular unique way where it struggles effectively when I'm helping parents work with kids who struggle with emotional and behavioral difficulties. The parents will very often, very understandably, really say that to me, like, wow, I just, none of this ever occurred to me. My kid could have an emotional problem, or my kid could be way too stressed out and not know how to deal with that, or my kid could be sad and not really know what to do about that, or my kid could have a kind of trauma or whatever's going on. And it's because for most people, all they were brought up with was just this kind of punishment misbehavior thing. Like, when I do good and please the adult, I'm rewarded, or at least not punished. And when I do anything that displeases them, I'm punished. And so what that does is it just uses a kind of force to mold behavior in a way that often can be very distorting, because there's not a lot of opportunity to really understand what's really going on, and to use growth and wisdom rather than power and force in order to navigate towards helpful behavior. So at any rate, this video is getting a little bit long. I normally don't do them this long, but folks wanted to hear a little bit more of a rambling, detailed thing from me on the subject of childhood anxiety. I could go on and on for hours on anxiety, how we go about treating it, how we would go about supporting kids who have anxiety. And there's just, if I were to go into all that right now, it would just be a very long video. Bottom line is, if you feel like your kid has anxiety problems, it's a very good idea to either talk with your doctor or to find a good child mental health professional to have a consultation with, because childhood anxiety is absolutely treatable. And it's often a lot easier to address when kids are young, before things have become even more deeply entrenched as patterns. It's still treatable when that's happened, but it just can be more difficult. So at any rate, thank you for listening. And please do let me know if you want to hear deep dives into other subjects that affect kids, like, I don't know, ADHD or depression, or, things like that. Bullying might be a subject that I could address too. So at any rate, thank you. Please stay tuned for the next one. And if you haven't already, please consider hitting a bell notification or down below, so that you can be notified when my videos get posted. And also please consider subscribing to the channel. So thank you, and take care. Bye-bye.